Hello everyone and welcome to the Property Podcast. It's episode 214. I'm Rob B with Rob D, and this week we're looking at how to create the perfect rental property. Let's get going.
Starting as we mean to go on there with a bit of a pun. Very good. Yes, we are talking about how to create the perfect rental property. So almost like a bit of a thought experiment. If you could take a property, have it as a blank canvas, do whatever you wanted to it, how do you turn it into the perfect property? Is there such a thing? Well, we will find out. We've also got a resource of the week that I think you will love if you're anything like us. And a news story that revolves around councils taking money off you. Surprise, surprise. But first, Rob, we're talking this week about getting started with a property, but we've been putting the finishing touches to things this week.
Very busy week, very busy. So let's start with the magazine. The magazine is about to hit people's doormats as you listen to this podcast. It may not be there now, but it'll be there very, very soon. And you'll see the lovely face of Kevin MacLeod on the front cover. For those who don't know who Kevin is, he's the presenter of Grand Designs, an amazing programme that many of us will watch and love, but his insights are brilliant. So if you haven't subscribed, don't worry. You can still get a copy digitally. We give you all the back copies, which include interviews with Sarah Beanie, Martin Roberts, and plenty of in-depth, really, really interesting, actionable articles as well. The magazine, Rob, as we talked about this earlier in the week, it's just where we can express ourselves in more detail, but actually, not just ourselves, we bring in really talented writers across the industry to put together something that we're very proud of.
Yeah, it is pretty awesome, if I do say so myself. I always enjoy reading the articles and checking them and approving them as they come through. There's some really good stuff in there. I think this is actually, I say it every time, I think this is our strongest one yet because I think it is getting stronger all the time. And along with each issue for our subscribers, we hold a webinar as well. It's a webinar for subscribers only. For this issue, we've got something very exciting lined up. We're just confirming it now. But if you are a subscriber, you'll be hearing about this, and I think you're going to get immense value out of this webinar. So many reasons to be a subscriber.
But if that wasn't enough, if that, wasn't enough to get us excited and up early every single morning, Rob, after all the grind, all the effort, all the talk, you've actually done it and you've delivered another book. But not just another book, because like the magazines, something that we can be proud of, but the books you can be proud of because they have been absolutely brilliant. And I don't just say that as a friend and a business partner, but they are. But this book, I think, has been missing in the collection. It's like there was a book missing out of all the things you've done. And I think you've plugged that hole now. You've plugged that gap. And I think people are going to be very excited. Your last book was brilliant, and I think your best yet, but you could top it again with this one.
Well, thank you very much. Very kind. Yeah, it's called How to Be a Landlord, which tells you what it's about. It's about how to let and manage your property. And I originally decided to write it because when you're getting started, there is nowhere you can go that just tells you what you need to do. And there's certainly nowhere that tells you in a kind of like an interesting and fun way. So I thought that needed to be done. But then as it came together and I pulled in lots of other people's expertise, it turned into something much more than that. And I've showed it to lots of people in advance who've helped me to proofread it and things like that. And they've said that even as landlords with years and years of experience, there's still lots in there that they can learn to not just get the basics, but to really finesse their role as a landlord, to make it more systematic, to reduce the amount of time they have to put in. So yeah, it's been a bit of a slog getting it done, but it is done. We're talking about listings this week, and we're going to talk about it again next week, and I'm sure we'll give the book a little bit of a mention then as well.
But don't worry, it's going to be packed with loads of content, including this week, which will be coming shortly. Loads to learn there. But before we do, let's look at a news story, Rob. This week, rogue landlords, beware. And I think this one's fair, Rob. Crack down on rogue landlords. They gave us a bad name. So I don't think anyone who's doing the right things is going to be annoyed by this one.
Well, hopefully not. So there are two new things that have just come into force that allow local authorities to have more power to crack down on landlords who are not doing what they're meant to. So all the more reason, of course, to learn what you are meant to be doing. Because if you do certain things wrong, you could now be faced with a fine of up to £30,000. There's also something called a rent repayment order coming in, which, as the name suggests, means that if you've been proven to do something wrong, you might have to refund your tenant for all the rent that they've paid. So both of those, the rent repayment and the fines, can be getting very, very expensive. Now, of course, if you are a good landlord and you're doing things properly, you shouldn't be worrying about this too much. because it's to do with things like failure to apply for an HMO license, breach of health and safety, unlawful eviction, all that kind of thing. Not something that any listeners to this podcast are going to be doing. The thing that makes me slightly nervous about this is that they are able to levy these penalties without taking you to court and proving you've done anything wrong. In other words, they can basically impose the fine first, and then the onus is on you to prove that you didn't do it and get it overturned. Luckily, local authorities are very well resourced, never make any mistakes, and don't use their powers to raise revenue beyond what they really should be doing. So we should be okay, but it does still make me a little bit nervous. So we'll see how this plays out. And if you want to read more about it, there's a link to a really good article on the Landlord Law blog about it. We'll link to that in the show notes this week, which are at thepropertyhub.net/perfectproperty.
Okay, so it's time for our main topic this week, how to create the perfect rental property. And yes, it's us warming up, getting ready for the celebrations. That is the launch of Rob's book next week. So this week, I'm going to give you a list of all the things you need to be thinking about to get your rental property absolutely spot on. This is one that if you're out and about and you're on a commute, feel free to carry on listening, but you might want to come back to this one with a pad and pen or however you like to take notes, because there's lots of information and we're going to just fire it at you. Lots to take down. So it's not really in-depth stuff that's going to move you to the core of your soul. It's more about, oh, that's a good point. Let me make a note of that one. So that's why we love the podcast. We can do all different types of episodes. This is one where you need a pad and pen, or at very least get back to the show notes later on where you'll find some of it. You're not going to get all the list in there though, so you will have to go back and listen. But this one, definitely a note-taking one. However, if you're listening and you're on the train or you're on a commute, don't worry. We'll try and be as entertaining as we can until you get back to your desk. Right. Rob, where should we start?
Well, let's be as entertaining as we can about flooring. So we're going to run through each aspect of a property and talk about how you might want to tackle that. If you're starting completely from scratch, what should you do to make the property perfect? So flooring is something that obviously is going to have a lot of wear and tear. If you get a really beautiful light coloured carpet, it's probably not going to look like that by the time you come to do the checkout. So what does the flooring look like in this kind of ideal hypothetical property? Well, you're probably going to be wanting to use laminate for areas like kitchens, bathrooms, and areas like hallways where there's going to be a lot of traffic. It needs to be good quality laminate though, because otherwise it could rip or it could warp when it gets wet. But if you get the right stuff, then it should last and hold up really well and last for a really long time. Dead easy to clean as well. If you are going to use carpet, which you'll probably want to do in some rooms, it should be dark coloured for very obvious reasons. And a little bit of a tip, something I picked up from someone who contributed this to the book. If you don't want to spend a fortune on carpet, get really good underlay. If you get good underlay, it'll make cheap carpet feel thicker. So there you go.
I always feel like I should do some Mexican joke around that, like underlay. Right, moving on. Okay, so you got your property, you're refurbing it, you're getting it right for the market. What else should you need to be looking at? Well, your walls. If they need work, then paint straight onto the plaster if you can. Obviously, if it's pretty shoddy and awful, then you can't do that, but it will save you a lot of money. So if you can paint straight onto the plaster, do that. Mainly white or very light grey paint. Keep it neutral. This is not the place where you should be showing off your personality. Keep the colour and the brand the same in every property. Because, think about it, you can store it up. It's easy to go and get it back every time. Don't go for some obscure brand or some obscure colour, because you won't be able to get it in the future. But by doing this, when you need to go back to it and touch it up in places, it's easy to do. Consider a feature wall. Mixed opinions on this one, but it can add that personality if you want to do it to your property. Water resistant eggshell or acrylic paint in the bathrooms and kitchen. So common sense stuff, but it might not be obvious to those who've not done it before. So water resistant eggshell or acrylic paint in the bathroom and the kitchen. So you've got your flooring done, you've got your painting done. What else?
Well, let's move on to the bathroom that you just mentioned. If you get a choice, then there's a few things that you can do. So the layout might preclude you from doing certain things. If the bathroom looks okay, then you're not going to want to rip it all out and start again just for this. But if you are starting with something that's a complete disaster, it needs to all be ripped out and start again, then there's a few things that you can do. Firstly, if you get a choice, then having a shower over the bath rather than a shower tray can be better. Shower trays tend to be leaky. And one thing you do not want is leaks. It gets very expensive and it's a hassle to deal with. So if you could have the shower over the bath rather than a tray, that's great. If you can have an electric shower, that's great too. Why? Because that way it's not dependent on the boiler. So if something goes wrong with the boiler, your tenants can still have a hot shower. So if it's the middle of December, they're still not going to be impressed. You're still going to need to get that boiler fixed quickly. It's still not an issue you want to face, but it will make them a little bit less bad-tempered if at least they can have a hot shower. Another thing to think about, again, the layout might not make this possible, but if it is possible, try to have a second bathroom or at least have another toilet, because that way, if one breaks, it's not an emergency. So a couple of things in here that you probably just would never think of if you're doing it for the first time. But if you can do these things, at first it sounds like it's just a matter of opinion. It's like just a personal thing, like, oh, have an electric shower. But actually, it's all geared around giving yourself an easier time and thinking down the track to, well, if something goes wrong, do I want to have to deal with this instantly because it'll be an emergency, or can I set it up so I'll buy myself a little bit of time? So it's all about planning ahead. And the same applies to kitchens.
Yeah, so kitchens are another area in the home that can do a great job at attracting tenants. They can have the wow factor. And you can put a kitchen in for reasonable money that looks quite good. But you don't even have to go there. If a kitchen is in place, consider looking at the cupboard doors and replacing them, and the work surfaces, and that might be enough to make it look new. So consider that before you go all out and replace the kitchen. Avoid integrated appliances. Do listen to this one. They are more expensive to buy. They're more of a faff to get out and fix. It's just not worth the hassle. In my opinion, I've got no data to back this, but I did work at Currys for a number of years. They seem to go wrong more as well. So avoid them. You may want to consider avoiding appliances altogether. It's going to depend on your rental market and where you are. Certain areas will just demand that you have white goods, and that's the expectation of the local rental market. But there are certain areas of the country where it's not the expectation. So make sure you understand your local area. And if you can get away without putting in a washing machine or a washer dryer, they're the things that tend to go wrong more than anything else in the property. So if you can avoid it, then you save yourself a whole load of headaches. Then we move outside to the beautiful garden. Pave over as much as you can. It's not about building the beautiful garden because tenants, most of them, won't want to maintain it. So keep it simple, keep it low maintenance. By paving over it or doing something similar will make it a lot easier to manage. Your rental property is not a place where you should be showing off your green finger skills. If you can, in the front now, convert some of the garden into a driveway or parking, do that too. Parking space, particularly in urban built-up areas, can often be very, very desirable for tenants, especially if there's permits on the street. So if you can do that, consider it.
Okay, back inside now, and let's talk electrics. So I move around a lot. I travel a lot, stay in lots of different places. The one thing that drives me mad more than anything else is a lack of plug sockets. You can never find anywhere to plug things in, or they're in precisely the wrong place. So you've got a desk, but there's no plug point near it, so you can't charge your laptop and things like that. It's really annoying. So if you're starting from scratch, it's the perfect time to make sure that there are plenty of plug sockets and they are in all the right places. So just stick one on every single wall, stick them everywhere. No one is going to be angry at you for doing so. You'll only get thanked by people like me. You could also, if you feel like it, get a little bit modern and put in those USB sockets as well. So it's got like the regular plug and it's got a USB port next to it. Because let's face it, pretty much everyone is juggling lots of devices these days. And it's another nice little touch. It's not going to be make or break about whether someone rents your property or not. But if you get the chance to create this perfect property, then it's something you might want to think about. And once you've done the electrical work, get an electrical safety check done. So an EICR, as it's called. I can never quite get that right. Because you're probably going to need one soon anyway. So at the moment in England and Wales, you don't need to have an electrical safety check. You need to be able to prove that the electrics are safe, but you don't need this specific check. But I reckon within the next 5 years, they'll probably become mandatory. So if you're doing the work anyway, you might as well just get it done and then it's that box ticked. And speaking of safety, there's a few other things that you should be doing as well. Even if you're not creating this perfect property, you should make sure that all the safety boxes are ticked. I go into a lot of detail about this in the book because it is important, even if it's a little bit dull. But if you're starting from scratch, start with hardwired smoke alarms because why not? All modern new build properties will have them. So why not make sure that it's in yours as well? Get the smoke alarms in the right places, get them hardwired, get a carbon monoxide alarm in any room that's got a boiler or has got a gas appliance in there, or anything that burns any kind of solid fuel. In England and Wales, again, you don't have to have it in rooms with boilers or appliances, but why not do it anyway? It's just safer. And get a heat detector in the kitchen, because you can't have a smoke detector because it'll be set off all the time by your lovely cooking, but get a heat detector in there instead. There are certain safety things that you have to do, but in the perfect property, why not go above and beyond and make it as safe as you possibly can?
Furnishing? What should you put in? Well, hopefully nothing. It's a bit of a nightmare. I'll keep it brief, but there are many benefits. People treat properties like their own homes, or more likely to if they bring their own furniture in. There's less stuff to replace, and people want stuff moved in and out and changed quite frequently. There's loads of reasons not to furnish your property. So avoid it if you can. And as we said, appliances, again, if you can, avoid it, but it will very much, for both furnishing and appliances, be dictated by the rental market itself. But if you have the option, don't do it. If you are using a letting agent, take their advice. They'll be able to tell you what the local market is doing if you don't know yourself. General things now, don't impose your own taste. We've touched on that earlier, but keep it simple. Don't over-spec it. So don't go over the top. Know your market. Don't go under either. It's a fine line. It is a balance, but don't go heavy one way or the other. Rental refurb is very different from a flip, remember. So you're not selling it to an owner-occupier. It's got to be a good standard if you want to attract a good tenant, but it doesn't need the marble bathrooms, for example. Be active in overseeing the project. Doesn't mean you have to do it. If this was me, I'd have no hope. But if you are going to refurb a property for rental purposes, then be active in its progress and make sure you're keeping an eye on what's going on.
And breathe. There's a lot in there. We've rattled through a whole load of stuff. Hopefully, while listening, there's been at least one or two things where you go, oh, that's a really good idea. If that's the case, go back, listen to the episode, pause and make some notes, because some bits will seem obvious, but then there'll be others that you just never would have thought of. And it's only when you have an issue with something, you realise, I really should have done it this way. So the great thing about episodes like this and information like this is you can learn from someone else's experience to save having to go through that learning experience yourself. You can shortcut the whole thing and you can make your life way easier. So when you're creating the perfect rental property, it's about creating a wonderful and desirable place to live, of course. But it's also about saving yourself as much hassle and expense down the road as you can. Like with so many things, if you set it up properly and in the right way in the first place, everything from there on gets easier. So there's lots more about this kind of thing in my book. It's called How to Be a Landlord. It's coming out next week. That is the 26th of April, 2017, if you're listening to this in the distant future. So this is just one of the many, many, many topics that it covers. We'll be getting into another of those topics next week. We'll be talking about what that is in a minute. But if you are interested in picking up the book, make sure you are listening to the podcast next week. Make sure you're listening to the podcast every week anyway, but especially listen next week because we'll be reminding you that it's coming out and telling you about some special bonuses that you can get if you buy it during the first week. So that is how to create the perfect rental property. And to find the notes for this week, go to thepropertyhub.net/perfectproperty.
Well, we have the perfect resource, well, a very good one anyway, and we'll be revealing next week's podcast very, very soon. But before we do, we have to thank this wonderful person who's left us a review. And this week's review comes from Paul. Hi, Rob and Rob. Can I say a massive 5-star thank you to you both? I'm Paul from Sheffield, and after a few years of falling out of love with property after a frustrating HMO quest, I started listening to your podcast back in April this year. I love your straightforward advice, tips, knowledge on both sides of the property investing coin. I recently bought a property, refurbed, and signed up a tenant for my new buy-to-let. I've just been accepted on another purchase and love being back on a property journey and reaching my goals. Again, a massive bravo for all your podcast, books, website, Rob D's starter pack. Truly great work. Thank you, Robs. Well, thank you, Paul. That's brilliant. And I'm glad you got back on the horse, because property can be frustrating, particularly if it happens on your first investment. This is a good wider lesson here. So many people get put off property because they have a bad first experience. Property is about the long term. Some things do go wrong at property. We've podcasted about it enough, but most things you can solve. And it might be that, and this is what possibly happened with Paul, he's picked the wrong strategy in the beginning. So don't be too disheartened if it doesn't go well straight away. It sounds like it's worked out well for Paul in the end. And I'm sure if you stick it for the long term, the end results will work for you too. Now, who loves commuting? No one, I hear you cry. And that's right, but we like to reduce our commutes. So this week's resource is one for you. If you're looking at commuting, if you're looking at moving, if you're looking at what your tenants may want to commute, this website's for you. We've looked at similar resources before, but commutefrom.com is a great resource. Unfortunately, it is London commute. So this is a resource just for London, but there are alternatives that we've talked about in the past that do countrywide. So check those out too. But this one, if you're looking to get across from one side of London to the other, or you're looking to move, or you're looking at how well connected the area is that you're proposing for your tenants, this one is for you. So a simple resource this week, but it's good fun, even if you're not going to use it properly, just to play around with some of the commutes to see where you can get to and what sort of times and which places are best connected. So we'll link to it in the show notes so you can have a look for yourself.
And you could also use it to find yourself a really long and painful commute, because that way you'll have more time to listen to the property podcast. There you go. Give yourself a 3-hour commute in the morning, get loads of podcasts done. Okay, maybe don't do that, but still do listen to the podcast next week. We're talking about property management the smart way. So today we talked about how to get your property set up. Next week, we're talking about how to actually manage your property once you've got tenants in there. We talked about lots of tips and tricks today. There's loads of tips and tricks you can use when it comes to property management to not just avoid the disasters that you really don't want to happen, but also to make your life way easier. So lots of insights in there from us, from other hub members, from the Yellow Lettings team, all of that to celebrate the book, How to Be a Landlord, which is coming out next week as well. So do make sure you listen.
Yes, and of course, we'll be having a bit of a party because we do love a book launch. So we'll be back next week with another episode on improving as a landlord. We'll be back on Tuesday with Ask Rob and Rob. But until then, have fun, take care, bye-bye.
Bye-bye. Thanks for listening to the Property Podcast. For show notes, all our past episodes, and to leave a review, go to thepropertyhub.net/podcast.